The last video sketched out what I was calling the happy utilitarian story of property law, and the argument that in certain contexts a property system will maximize aggregate wealth either by preserving the value of common resources or alternatively providing an incentive to invest in the improvement of resources. And in this video, I want to begin telling the other side of the story, reasons why we might be suspicious of resorting to a property rights regime in particular contexts. And so we'll be discussing three arguments here. Number one, the availability of alternative mechanisms for managing the problem of common resources. Number two, objections to property regimes that are independent of the question of what maximizes aggregate wealth. And three, reasons why a property system may not provide its intended benefits depending on the circumstances. So in this video, we'll consider the first two sets of objections, and the next video will consider the third. So let's get to it. Recall in the last video we talked a lot about property rights as being a mechanism to manage the so-called tragedy of the commons. Now, it's important to understand that there are multiple ways of addressing the problem of a commons, and we see a lot of these in everyday life. We have government regulation of, say, the park. The park is shared among people in the area, yet we have regulations that set rules that will prevent people from, shall we say, over-consuming the benefits of the park. You can't tear up the land, you can't make too much noise, that sort of thing. And on the subject of the state, of course, with respect to the making of investments to improve resources, obviously the state is capable of doing that as well. And things like national defense or the provision of certain kinds of resources, the state can do that. Now, that may just still be talking about property by another means, only talking about public property rather than private property. So it's also important to note that we can address issues of common resources or investment without necessarily thinking about either the state or about private property. For example, there are social norms. Even in the absence of law, there are certain social expectations about how one is supposed to behave. There's any number of examples of local customs and other ways people engage in everyday cooperation. And it's important to understand that in the utilitarian story, we're talking about an argument for property rights that may hold under certain circumstances, but not necessarily all circumstances. There are a wide range of human arrangements that are available, and property systems are just one. That's an easy thing to overlook when one grows up in a property system, where it kind of shapes our background expectations. There are plenty of non-property systems that have emerged to manage common resources without a tragedy of the commons, and a person who's really well known for describing these systems is Elinor Ostrom. She won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work in that subject.
And government ownership or private property is presumed to be optimal, and there are times it is. But there's also the case that people self-organize common property institutions of a wide diversity of kind, and sometimes solve problems very well.
So that's the first set of objections to the utilitarian story of property rights, that there are alternative mechanisms of managing common resources and also making investments in the same. But even when we are convinced that we are in contexts in which a property system or property rights may give us maximum output, there may, however, be situations in which we have moral objections to a property system that have absolutely nothing to do with the utilitarian case. That is, even if we maximize output with property rights, we still may choose not to use them for a variety of reasons. And those are important to keep in mind because the story of producing more wealth does not really have anything to say to these non-utilitarian objections. One set of critiques comes under the umbrella of what we might call commodification. Now, this is a broad concept with a lot of applications, and as always, I don't want to piss off any philosophers or economists, so I'm going to be relatively brief and general here. The commodification critique covers a range of criticisms of property systems that are linked by the idea that there is something lost or that there is a harm in taking things that were once outside of the market economy, for example, because they were in nature or otherwise free, or the subject of gifts, or purely interpersonal, and so on, and making those things part of the market, something that can be bought or sold. And commodification arguments apply even in free societies in which transactions are legal and voluntary. The argument is that there is still a harm to making certain activities subject to the marketplace, making them up for sale or otherwise applying the logic of the marketplace to them. For example, a mindset that treats food animals as commodities to be grown, bought, and sold at maximum efficiency may lead, absent regulation, to horrific factory farming practices. Commodification arguments can be made in a range of areas. For example, the billable hour paired against the lost values of professionalism, or treatment of labor more generally. You can find commodification arguments about culture, about our data, the natural world, or even things like holidays, right? The commercialization of the Christmas season being a common complaint, and so on and so on and so on. Again, this is a broad set of critiques, but the point is that the objection is not about a failure to use resources efficiently, but rather that something important is lost when that is the goal that is being pursued. Or perhaps more plausibly, if that goal is pursued to the exclusion of all others. And related to this is the idea that certain transactions are simply immoral for reasons that are external to a property system or concerns about social or individual welfare. These reasons have multiple sources, including religion, moral reasoning, basic moral instincts, conceptions of human dignity, nature and culture, and so on. Of course, utilitarian arguments are simply beside the point if one's metric of evaluation is rooted elsewhere. And then, of course, there's a distribution objection. Assuming arguendo that we decide that property rights should govern the allocation of particular resources, it raises the question of who gets to be the one who benefits from the existence of the property rights, the question of allocation, and then the question of distribution of wealth and power in society once we have a property system. What if we have a situation where some people just have a lot more than others? And is there a point where unequal distribution becomes a basis of an overall critique of the system? A system can be efficient but unfair, and leaving open the question of what precisely rises to the level of being unfair, because that, of course, will be the subject of a lot of debate. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that the fact that a system may be efficient does nothing to counter the objection of unfair distribution. Though there are arguments that certain unfair distributions may undermine the goal of a property system in maximizing aggregate welfare, and that subject takes us to the next video, which will be a discussion of the various ways in which a property system may fail on its own terms to maximize aggregate wealth.